The road was almost empty, a thin gray ribbon of frozen asphalt stretching between dark fields and low factory buildings. Winter had already settled into the city's outskirts, and the sky was heavy with cold, blue-black clouds that pressed low over the rooftops. Sergei Platonov drove slowly, carefully, his hands resting easily on the cracked steering wheel of his old Oka. The heater hummed weakly, barely keeping the windshield clear. On the passenger seat lay his army rucksack, faded and patched, with a thermos tucked into its side pocket. Everything about the car, about the man, spoke of long years of quiet endurance. Sergei's face was calm, but his eyes were watchful. He had learned that habit long ago. The war had ended for the world, but for him it never completely stopped. Even now, decades later, every road, every shadow, every sudden movement registered somewhere deep inside him before his mind could catch up. The traffic light ahead flickered from green to yellow. He slowed. A black Mercedes stood in front of him, engine purring, paint gleaming under the pale street lamp. It was the kind of car that didn't belong on this broken edge of town. Too expensive, too confident. The driver's brake lights suddenly flared bright red. Sergei reacted instantly, but the distance was too short. The Oka bumped the Mercedes with a dull, harmless thud. Metal kissed metal, nothing more. Sergei sighed quietly and switched off the engine. Before he could even open his door, all four doors of the Mercedes flew open. Three young men spilled out onto the road, their movements sharp, rehearsed, almost theatrical. They were dressed too neatly for the district. Expensive jackets, white sneakers untouched by slush, gold chains glinting at their collars. "Hey, are you blind, old man?" one of them shouted. Another circled the Mercedes, bending down dramatically, inspecting the bumper. "Look at this. He destroyed it." The third already had a phone out, camera pointed directly at Sergei as he stepped from his car. Sergei closed his door slowly and straightened up. The cold bit into his cheeks, but he barely noticed. He looked at the two cars, then at the men. The bumper of the Mercedes showed a long scratch, yellowed with rust. Old. Not from this moment. Sergei knew the game immediately. Car set up. Autopodstava. The third man laughed loudly for the camera. "This grandpa rammed us on purpose. Pay for the damage." The second snapped. "Right now." Sergei's voice was calm, even. "Let's call the traffic police." Their laughter came together, sharp and mocking. "Police." The first scoffed. "Why waste time?" The man with the phone moved closer, shoving the lens near Sergei's face. "You don't want trouble, do you? We'll solve it right here. Cash." They stepped closer, forming a loose circle around him. Sergei didn't move. His hands hung loosely at his sides. His breathing stayed slow. "I said," he repeated, "call the police." The second man's smile vanished. "You think you're clever." He pushed Sergei in the chest, not hard, just enough to test him. Sergei took one small step back. Snow crunched under his boot. Memories stirred. Mountains. Gunfire. The smell of diesel and blood. Orders shouted in the dark. He blinked once. The past settled. He slowly reached up, unzipped his jacket, and slipped it off. He folded it carefully and placed it on the hood of his Oka. The men exchanged looks, unsure whether to laugh or hesitate. "Boys," Sergei said quietly, "I gave you a chance." The first man rushed him. The move was fast but sloppy. Sergei turned his shoulder, hooked the attacker's arm, and dropped him to the ground in one smooth motion. The man slammed onto the frozen asphalt, the air bursting from his lungs. The second swung wildly. Sergei ducked, stepped in, and struck him with the heel of his palm under the jaw. The man collapsed beside his friend, choking. The third froze for half a second, then turned and ran. Sergei caught him after 3 steps. He seized the man's collar, twisted his arm behind his back, and drove him face first into the road. "Down," Sergei said. All 3 lay sprawled, groaning. Sergei looked at them. "Push-up position," he ordered. They obeyed. The wind carried the distant sound of traffic and sirens. Sergei picked up his jacket and put it back on, his movements calm, unhurried, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. The cold asphalt pressed into their palms and knees. The 3 young men shook, hardly from the winter air, hardly from the shock of how fast everything had turned. "Hold it," Sergei said quietly. None of them argued. For a few seconds there was only the sound of wind moving across the empty road and the distant hum of the city. Snowflakes drifted lazily down, catching in their hair and on their jackets. The expensive Mercedes idled with its headlights still on, like a silent witness to their humiliation. The one with the phone tried to lift his head. Sergei placed the sole of his boot between the man's shoulder blades and pressed, not hard, just enough to remind him of gravity. Eyes down. The man swallowed and obeyed. Sergei's heartbeat was slow and steady. His breathing hadn't changed. The movements he had made were as natural to him as walking. The body never forgets. Training doesn't rust. It waits. He looked at their car again, at the long rusty scratch on the bumper. Old paint. Old damage. He had seen this exact trick 100 times. Back in the 90s, in Moscow, in Rostov, in provincial towns like this one. Young predators looking for weak prey. Pensioners. Migrant workers. Women alone at the wheel. They had thought an old man in a cheap car was perfect. The first one groaned and shifted. Sergei nudged him with his boot. Still. The man froze. Minutes passed. Finally the second one spoke, his voice muffled against the road. Listen, Grandpa, we can just forget it, okay? Sergei looked down at him. You already forgot, Sergei said. You forgot how to behave. The man with the gold chain started to cry quietly. Not sobbing. Just soft, panicked breaths. The kind that come when someone realizes the world isn't under their control anymore. Sergei felt no anger, no triumph, just a tired sadness. He had seen this before too. Young men who thought strength meant intimidation. Who thought fear was power. Who had never been hit by reality hard enough to wake them. He took a step back and pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was cracked, but it worked. He dialed the traffic police. His voice was calm, factual. Minor accident on industrial road. Possible attempted extortion. Yes. 3 individuals restrained. No injuries. All wait. He ended the call. The 3 men exchanged terrified glances without lifting their heads. The one closest to Sergei whispered, You called the cops. Yes, you didn't have to do that. Sergei shrugged slightly. You should have thought of that before you chose your profession. The man flinched at the word. Time moved slowly. The cold crept through their jackets. Their hands began to ache. The silence became unbearable. The first one muttered, We didn't know, we thought you were just some old guy. Sergei looked at the fields beyond the road. Beyond them, somewhere far away, were mountains he had once crossed under fire. Friends he had buried, nights that had no end. I am just an old guy, he said. That's the problem. They were quiet after that. A distant siren finally cut through. The wind. The 3 men stiffened. The Mercedes engine sputtered, then went silent as the sirens grew louder. 2 patrol cars pulled up. Blue lights washed over the snow and the road and the cheap yellow paint of Sergei's Oka. Officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts, eyes taking in the scene. What's going on here? One asked. Sergei stepped forward, lifting his hands slightly to show he wasn't a threat. I'm the driver of the Oka. They attempted an extortion after a staged collision. One of them recorded the whole thing. The officer nodded. Where's the phone? Sergei pointed. The device lay near the curb where it had fallen from the man's hand during the scuffle. The officer picked it up, pressed the screen. The video immediately began to play. Their laughter, their threats, the shove, the first strike. The officer's jaw tightened. Another officer pulled the 3 men to their feet and searched them. None resisted. They looked small now, young, broken. The first officer returned the phone to his pocket and looked at Sergei. You okay? Sergei nodded. Any injuries? No. The officer studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. Thank you for keeping this under control. Sergei shook his hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive. The officers turned their attention to the 3 scammers, cuffing them, reading their rights. The gold chain clinked softly as one of them was led away. As they were loaded into the patrol car, the one who had tried to run looked back at Sergei, his face pale. That's not fair, he whispered. Sergei met his eyes. Neither is what you do. The car doors slammed shut. The sirens cut off. Silence returned to the road. The officers finished their report, returned Sergei's documents, and waved him on. He climbed back into his Oka. The heater sputtered back to life. He sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, breathing. Outside, the patrol cars pulled away. Sergei put the car in gear and drove on. The road opened in front of him, long and empty, stretching toward the dark horizon. The war was far behind him, but it had never really left. It never does. And tonight, once again, it had spoken, not with bullets, but with the quiet certainty of a man who knows exactly who he is. The night had fully fallen by the time Sergei reached the outer districts of the city. Streetlights glowed like pale moons along the roadside, reflecting off the thin layer of frost that covered the asphalt. The events of the evening replayed in his mind, not with excitement, not with pride, but with the same distant, detached clarity he had felt after many dangerous moments in his life. Some memories shout, others simply stay. He drove slowly, letting the road stretch, letting the engine's soft rattle soothe his nerves. His old Oka had carried him through many years, many storms. It was not fast, not impressive, but it was loyal, and that was enough. At the next intersection he stopped for fuel. The small station stood half-lit, the shop window glowing warmly in the cold darkness. Sergei parked near the pump and stepped out. The smell of gasoline mixed with winter air. Inside, the cashier, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, glanced up, then did a double take. "You all right, sir?" she asked. "Yes," Sergei replied, giving a polite nod. He paid for a few liters, bought a bottle of water and some bread, then stepped back outside. The cold bit sharper now. He leaned against the hood of his car and took a slow drink, watching his breath turn to mist. He thought of the young men. Not with anger, with concern. He had seen their kind too often. In the 90s, in the chaos after the collapse, in towns where factories died and hope went with them. Boys, who grew into men without ever learning what real strength was. Men who believed fear was respect. Who confused power with cruelty. He shook his head slightly and got back into the car. The road beyond the station wound through quiet neighborhoods. Apartment blocks loomed on either side, their windows glowing like scattered constellations. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a train horn echoed. Sergei's phone buzzed. A message from his old unit's group chat. They rarely wrote now, but sometimes someone sent a photo, a joke, a memory. "Still alive, brother," the message read. Sergei smiled faintly and typed back. "Still here." He turned the radio on low. A familiar song from decades ago drifted through the speakers, one he hadn't heard since the early days after his return from the war. It pulled something loose inside him. He remembered the first time he drove after coming home. His hands had shaken. Every loud noise made him flinch. He had felt like a stranger in his own country, in his own skin. Time had healed much, but not everything. The city thinned into industrial zones, then into open road. The sky was clear now, the stars sharp and cold. As he drove, he thought about what the officer had said. "Thank you for keeping this under control." He had not kept it under control. He had simply done what had to be done. There is a difference. At a red light, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. Gray hair, lines around his eyes, the face of someone who had lived long and seen too much. He whispered, "We're still here," to no one in particular. The light turned green. He continued on. Several kilometers later, the road curved near a river. He pulled over and cut the engine. The night was quiet. The water moved slowly, black and endless, carrying reflections of the stars. Sergei stepped out and walked to the railing. The cold wind brushed his coat. He took the thermos from his bag and poured himself tea. Steam rose, smelling of mint and smoke. He drank. The world felt very large and very quiet. Somewhere, far behind him, 3 young men sat in the back of a police car, staring at the floor, their laughter long gone. Somewhere ahead, dawn would come. Sergei closed his eyes for a moment. He had survived war. He had survived life. Tonight had been only a small test. He opened his eyes, finished his tea, and returned to his car. The road waited, and he drove.